The Forgotten Kingdom rises. Welcome to Forgotten Civilizations, where we uncover the lost history of the ancient Americas, the cities, empires, and mysteries that time tried to erase. In the heart of what is now eastern Oklahoma lies a landscape that appears ordinary. Gentle hills, grassy fields, and quiet rivers winding through the plains. But beneath this unassuming surface rests one of the most important archaeological sites in North America, Spiro, a city built nearly 1,000 years ago by a people whose influence stretched across the continent. The Spiro Mounds stand as silent witnesses to a time when native civilizations flourished across the American heartland. Long before European contact, long before the colonies or the frontier, this land was home to a thriving world of complex societies, each with its own rulers, priests, artisans, and warriors. Among them, the city of Spiro was one of the crown jewels, a ceremonial center whose influence reached from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. Archaeologists call this culture the Mississippian civilization, a vast network of towns and cities connected by trade, religion, and shared beliefs. At its height, between 900 and 1450 CE, the Mississippian world was the dominant force in eastern North America. Spiro was not the largest of these cities, but it was one of the most spiritual and symbolically powerful. Spiro's people were mound builders, architects of earth who shaped the land into sacred forms. They constructed enormous flat-topped mounds that served as platforms for temples and elite residences. Around these sacred centers were plazas where rituals, dances, and ceremonies unfolded. The entire city was aligned with celestial patterns, a reflection of their deep connection to the cosmos. For centuries, these people prospered along the Arkansas River, using its fertile floodplains to grow corn, beans, and squash, the three sacred crops of their world. Trade routes linked them to other Mississippian cities such as Cahokia, Etowah, and Moundville, creating a continent-spanning network of exchange. Shells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and exotic feathers from Central America all found their way to Spiro. But the wealth of Spiro wasn't measured only in material goods. It was also a spiritual and intellectual center. The priests and leaders who lived atop its mounds were custodians of sacred knowledge, keepers of myths, and mediators between the earthly world and the spiritual realm. For them, the landscape itself was alive. The rivers were arteries of the earth. The mounds were mountains of creation, and the sky was a map of the divine. Every structure, every ceremony, every artifact had meaning, part of a vast cosmology that bound the people together in purpose and belief. When the first European explorers arrived in the Mississippi Valley centuries later, they found only echoes of this vanished world, the descendants of once great nations, scattered by time and tragedy. But Spiro had long since been abandoned, its temples collapsed, its treasures buried beneath centuries of soil. It wasn't until the early 20th century that the world rediscovered Spiro, and with it, one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries in American history. In the 1930s, during the depths of the Great Depression, treasure hunters in Oklahoma began to dig into one of the largest mounds at Spiro, known as the Craig Mound. What they uncovered was beyond imagination, and it would forever change how we understand the ancient peoples of North America. Inside the mound lay a burial chamber filled with an astonishing array of artifacts: finely woven textiles, wooden carvings, engraved shell gorgets, copper plates, ceremonial weapons, and masks. Many of these objects were preserved in near-perfect condition thanks to the mound's sealed clay walls, a time capsule of a civilization's soul. Among the treasures were copper plates depicting the Birdman, a powerful mythological figure symbolizing strength, war, and transformation. There were effigy pipes carved in human and animal forms, beautifully adorned clothing, and sacred bundles tied with feathers and shells. These were not the relics of a primitive people. They were the products of a highly organized society with advanced artistry, trade networks, and spiritual sophistication. Yet the story of Spiro's rediscovery is also one of tragedy. The initial excavation was not led by archaeologists, but by looters, who destroyed much of the site while searching for items to sell. Priceless artifacts were scattered across private collections, and some were lost forever. Only later did professional archaeologists step in to salvage what remained, carefully documenting the surviving materials and reconstructing Spiro's story from the fragments. Through these finds, we learned that Spiro was not just a local town. It was a religious and political hub, a place where leaders and priests gathered from across the Mississippian world to perform ceremonies that unified distant nations. It was a sacred site, a center of pilgrimage, where the living came to honor the dead, and where the balance between earth and sky was maintained through ritual and reverence. Today, as the sun sets over the grass-covered mounds, it's hard to imagine the splendor that once existed here. The sound of drums echoing across the plains, the flicker of firelight from temple tops, and the gathering of thousands for sacred festivals. But beneath the soil of Oklahoma, the memory of Spiro still lingers, a forgotten kingdom that once ruled the spiritual heart of ancient America, the heart of a sacred empire. As the centuries unfolded, Spiro became one of the most influential ceremonial centers of the Mississippian world, a sprawling cultural network that once stretched across 2/3 of what is now the United States. From the forests of the Great Lakes to the swamps of the Gulf Coast, the Mississippian civilization shared a common set of symbols, rituals, and beliefs. And at the heart of that spiritual web stood Spiro, the sacred city of the plains. The city itself was a carefully planned and living map of the cosmos. At its core lay a large plaza, a vast open space where festivals, dances, and public gatherings brought the people together. Around the plaza, rising above the horizon, were the earthen mounds that gave Spiro its sacred power. Each mound served a purpose. Some were temple platforms, others elite residences, and a few were burial sites for priests and leaders. The Craig Mound, the largest and most elaborate of them all, stood slightly apart from the others, a sacred necropolis that held the remains of Spiro's rulers and the most precious ritual objects of the society. Archaeologists believe that it functioned much like a temple tomb, a place where the boundary between life and death was bridged through ceremony. The architecture of Spiro mirrored the structure of Mississippian religion. The people believed in a 3-tiered universe, the upper world of the sky and spirits, the middle world of humans and animals, and the lower world of water and chaos. The mounds were built as symbolic connections between these realms, mountains of earth linking the heavens and the underworld. On the summit of these mounds stood wooden temples made from wattle and daub, their thatched roofs glistening in the morning sun. Within these sanctuaries burned eternal fires, tended by priests who carried the responsibility of maintaining cosmic order. Each ritual performed here was an act of balance, an offering to ensure that the rains would come, the crops would grow, and the world would remain in harmony. The people of Spiro were farmers, traders, artisans, and warriors. Their economy was rooted in maize agriculture, which supported a dense population and allowed the elite class to flourish. Skilled craftsmen created goods of astonishing detail: engraved shells, copper ornaments, carved pipes, and painted pottery, each object imbued with spiritual symbolism. Trade was the lifeblood of Spiro. From this city, goods flowed along the rivers like veins of commerce and culture. The Arkansas and Mississippi rivers served as superhighways, linking Spiro to far-flung communities. Excavations have revealed materials that came from hundreds of miles away: copper from Michigan, marine shells from Florida, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, obsidian from the Rockies, and even turquoise from the Southwest. But this was not trade for profit. It was trade for meaning. Each object carried spiritual significance, each exchange an act of diplomacy and respect. Through these networks, ideas and beliefs traveled, creating a shared religious language that united the continent. The Mississippian religion that tied Spiro to its sister cities revolved around a complex system of deities, ancestral spirits, and cosmic forces. Central to their belief system was the Birdman, a mythological hero who embodied both war and renewal, the power of life and death, order and chaos. Artifacts from Spiro depict the Birdman with outstretched wings, sometimes in flight, sometimes holding ceremonial weapons or serpents. His image appeared on copper plates, shell engravings, and painted pottery, symbolizing transformation and the eternal cycle of nature. The Birdman wasn't merely a god to be worshipped. He was a symbol of human potential, the ability to ascend from the mortal realm to the divine. For the warriors and priests of Spiro, the Birdman represented a path of spiritual elevation, a sacred reminder that through sacrifice, courage, and ceremony, humans could reach the heavens. Spiro's leaders, often referred to by archaeologists as chiefs or high priests, held both political and religious power. Their authority came not only from control of resources, but from their perceived connection to the spiritual world. They were intermediaries between the people and the gods, responsible for interpreting omens, conducting ceremonies, and ensuring that the community remained in balance with the cosmos. During great festivals, thousands would gather in the central plaza. Drums echoed across the plains, dancers in elaborate regalia moved in rhythmic patterns, and priests recited chants that invoked the powers of the upper and lower worlds. These gatherings were more than celebrations. They were moments when the entire community reconnected with the sacred order of existence. At night, the flickering firelight illuminated the mounds and the wooden temples atop them, creating an otherworldly spectacle. The people believed that their ancestors watched from the stars, guiding and protecting them. Offerings of food, feathers, and ornaments were placed in sacred pits, gifts to ensure the favor of the spirits. But beneath this grandeur lay a rigid social structure. The society of Spiro was hierarchical, divided into nobles, priests, warriors, artisans, and farmers. At the top stood a hereditary elite who controlled not only wealth, but the flow of spiritual power. Their authority was reinforced by ritual, by the ceremonies that reaffirmed their divine right to lead. This blend of religion, politics, and economics created stability, but also tension. Maintaining balance required constant attention to the rituals that bound the world together. A failed harvest, a natural disaster, or the death of a ruler could threaten that equilibrium, forcing the priests to seek answers from the gods through fasting, sacrifice, and divination. As Spiro's influence spread across the Mississippian world, it became a center of pilgrimage. People from distant settlements traveled hundreds of miles to attend ceremonies, trade goods, or seek blessings from the priests. These journeys strengthened the cultural unity of the Mississippian sphere and turned Spiro into one of the most revered sacred cities in ancient America. Yet, even as the city thrived, forces were already at work that would one day bring about its decline. Environmental change, shifting trade routes, and internal conflict would slowly unravel the delicate web that sustained this spiritual empire. But for now, in the golden age of the Mississippians, Spiro stood tall, the radiant heart of a forgotten kingdom. As dawn broke over the plains, light touched the tops of the mounds, illuminating the temples and fields. The people of Spiro rose to greet the sun, the giver of life and symbol of rebirth. It was a moment that connected them to the cosmos, a daily reminder that they lived at the center of a sacred world. The treasures beneath the earth. As centuries passed, the sacred site of Spiro continued to evolve, growing in power, prestige, and mystery. The city's priests and artisans transformed earth, wood, and copper into monuments and relics that spoke of their deep connection to the spiritual realm. Every artifact, every mound, every line in the soil was crafted with intention, but the story of Spiro's splendor would remain buried for nearly 1,000 years, waiting for the world to rediscover it. When modern eyes first gazed upon the Craig Mound, it was little more than a grassy hill. Yet beneath that mound lay one of the richest archaeological treasures in all of North America, a vault of sacred objects perfectly preserved by time and clay. In the early 1930s, the United States was gripped by the Great Depression. Jobs were scarce, and desperation drove many to seek fortunes wherever they could. In eastern Oklahoma, rumors began to spread of ancient mounds filled with gold, silver, and precious stones. To local eyes, they looked like opportunities. A group of men, calling themselves the Puckala Mining Company, obtained permission from the landowner to dig into the Craig Mound. Their methods were crude: shovels, picks, and dynamite, and they had little understanding of what they were destroying. They weren't archaeologists. They were treasure hunters. When their digging broke through into the chamber, what they found was not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable: a glimpse into a lost civilization's soul. Inside the mound lay a burial chamber roughly 12 feet long and 6 feet high, lined with woven mats and wooden timbers. Within it rested hundreds of human remains, priests, nobles, and perhaps even kings, accompanied by thousands of sacred objects. There were wooden masks, carved with haunting expressions, preserved so perfectly that the grain of the wood still shimmered beneath the clay. There were cloths and textiles, dyed with vibrant colors, some patterned with intricate geometric designs. The preservation was so remarkable that even delicate feathers, beads, and plant fibers had survived the centuries. The looters filled wagon loads of these treasures and sold them to collectors and dealers across the country. Many of the finest pieces were lost, scattered into private hands, their context destroyed forever. By the time professional archaeologists arrived, much of the site had already been plundered. But even in the wreckage, archaeologists uncovered enough to piece together the grandeur of what had once been. The artifacts from Spiro revealed a civilization of profound artistry and spiritual depth. Copper plates, hammered and engraved with scenes of myth and ceremony, depicted the birdman, warriors, serpents, and supernatural beings. Shell gorgets, carved from marine shells that had traveled hundreds of miles, displayed sacred cosmological symbols. Some of these designs mirrored those found in distant Mississippian cities like Etowah, Moundville, and Cahokia, suggesting that Spiro had been part of a shared religious network, a confederation of cities bound by faith. One of the most striking finds was a wooden effigy mask covered in copper and shaped into the visage of a deity. Its eyes, made of shell, seemed to gaze back across the centuries. To the people of Spiro, such an object would have been more than art. It was a vessel of spiritual power, used in ceremonies to invoke the presence of divine beings. In addition to ceremonial objects, the burial chamber contained everyday tools and ornaments, evidence of the people's complex and advanced way of life. There were beautifully crafted pipes used for ritual smoking, bone tools polished smooth by use, and jewelry made from rare materials. Each artifact told a story. The copper plates spoke of mythology and heroism, the shell gorgets of connection to the sea and the underworld, the effigy pipes of communication with the spirit realm. Together, they painted a vivid portrait of a people who saw no separation between the sacred and the mundane. Among the most extraordinary discoveries were textiles, a rare find in any archaeological site. These fabrics were woven with skill and sophistication, some embroidered with designs resembling constellations and celestial symbols. They revealed a people who not only mastered their environment but understood the heavens. The sheer variety of materials, wood, copper, shell, stone, and cloth, reflected a civilization that reached far beyond its local environment. Trade brought them not only goods but ideas, beliefs, and artistic styles. Spiro was not isolated. It was part of a living network of cultural exchange that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Archaeologists were astonished by what they found, not just the objects themselves, but their meaning. Many of the designs echoed symbols from myths still remembered by native nations today, such as the Cherokee, Caddo, Osage, and Choctaw, who are believed to descend in part from the Mississippian peoples. The birdman, for instance, appears in stories of the thunderers, sky spirits who bring storms and lightning. The serpent figures recall the underwater panther, a creature of chaos and power dwelling beneath the earth. These symbols formed part of a worldview that balanced the forces of creation and destruction, life and death. The Spiro artifacts revealed that this wasn't simply a burial site. It was a repository of power, a ceremonial center designed to maintain the balance of the world. Each object was placed with purpose, part of a ritual that linked the living with the ancestors and the cosmos. Modern analysis has shown that many of the copper plates were created using techniques far more advanced than once believed. The artisans of Spiro hammered and annealed copper sheets, embossed intricate patterns, and polished the surfaces to a mirror-like shine, all without the benefit of metal tools. Their craftsmanship rivaled that of the ancient Old World civilizations. Today, many of these surviving treasures are preserved in museums, including the Smithsonian Institution and the Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center in Oklahoma. Yet countless others remain missing, lost to private collections, their origins forgotten. The tragedy of the looting of Spiro serves as a reminder of how fragile history can be, how easily the voices of the past can be silenced by greed. But even through the damage, the legacy of Spiro endures. Each artifact that survived tells us something profound, that the people of Spiro were not primitive, but deeply intelligent, not isolated, but globally connected, not forgotten, but waiting to be remembered. As archaeologists carefully reconstructed the city's history from the fragments left behind, a clearer image emerged of a civilization whose influence extended across the American continent, whose spiritual traditions shaped generations, and whose legacy still whispers in the wind that sweeps across the mounds. The priests, the warriors, and the gods. The city of Spiro was not only a center of trade and art, it was a place of ritual, hierarchy, and divine purpose. To understand its people, one must look beyond the mounds of earth and the artifacts buried beneath them. Spiro's heart was its faith, a belief system that shaped its society and gave meaning to every action, every festival, and every mound that touched the sky. At the core of this world stood the priests, the guardians of sacred knowledge. They were the interpreters of the cosmos, the keepers of the rituals that bound heaven and earth. Their authority came from their perceived closeness to the divine, and their power was reinforced by ceremony and symbol. The priests lived atop the mounds, physically and spiritually elevated above the people. From their temples, they observed the stars, the solstices, and the movement of the moon. They were astronomers as much as theologians, for in the Mississippian world, astronomy was not science, it was prophecy. The layout of Spiro itself reflected this cosmic order. The central plaza and surrounding mounds were aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, representing the balance of creation. The rising sun marked the east, the realm of life and renewal. The west, where it set, symbolized death and the journey to the afterlife. Each major mound at Spiro was part of a grand sacred geometry, a living map of their universe. The priests believed that by recreating the cosmos in earth and wood, they could maintain harmony between the seen and unseen worlds. To the Mississippians, every element of the natural world carried spiritual weight. The rivers were lifelines of the earth. The mounds were artificial mountains, portals to the divine. Fire symbolized transformation. Water represented the underworld. The sky was filled with gods and ancestors, while the beneath was home to powerful spirits that both nourished and threatened life. In this cosmology, balance was everything. The role of the priests was to preserve that balance through ritual, sacrifice, and storytelling. The people of Spiro celebrated seasonal festivals that followed the agricultural calendar. Planting, harvest, and renewal were sacred acts. Each year, during the green corn ceremony, communities gave thanks to the spirits for the bounty of the fields. Old fires were extinguished, symbolizing purification, and new fires were lit from the sacred flame kept by the priests. It was a time of forgiveness, rebirth, and unity. Music, dance, and performance were essential to these rituals. Drums echoed across the plains, their beats mimicking the pulse of life itself. Dancers, painted with sacred symbols, wore feathers and shells that jingled with every movement, a living prayer in motion. The people believed that through dance they could communicate directly with the spirits. Alongside the priests stood the warriors, protectors of the community and enforcers of divine order. Their role extended beyond battle. In Mississippian culture, war was not merely conflict. It was ritualized combat, often tied to cosmological themes of life, death, and renewal. The Birdman, a divine hero depicted in many of Spiro's artifacts, embodied this ideal. He represented the fusion of human courage and divine power. Warriors sought to emulate his strength and spiritual discipline. Some artifacts show the Birdman holding ceremonial weapons, not tools of destruction, but of transformation. To die honorably in battle was to ascend toward the heavens. To live courageously was to maintain harmony on earth. In this worldview, the line between religion and warfare disappeared. Both were sacred duties. Spiro's social hierarchy reflected this union of the sacred and the worldly. At the top were the chiefs, often both political rulers and high priests. Beneath them were the warriors and artisans, those who served the community through protection or craft. Farmers, hunters, and laborers formed the foundation, providing the sustenance that allowed the civilization to thrive. But even ordinary citizens were connected to the sacred order. Every person participated in rituals that reaffirmed their place in the cosmic balance. Children learned myths that explained the world's creation. Elders passed down oral histories that kept ancestral memory alive. Among these myths were stories of the sky people and the underwater beings, tales that taught respect for nature's forces. Thunder was the voice of the gods. Serpents and panthers ruled the waters below. Each storm, each flood, was both danger and blessing, a reminder of the delicate equilibrium between creation and destruction. In the temples atop the mounds, priests conducted ceremonies of renewal and communication with the ancestors. Offerings of food, feathers, and sacred tobacco were burned, their smoke carrying prayers skyward. Some ceremonies may have involved trance states, fasting, or the use of ritual pipes to bridge the human and spiritual realms. The priests' regalia reflected their divine role, elaborate costumes made of feathers, copper ornaments, and shell jewelry. Masks carved from wood or shell transformed the wearer into a living embodiment of the spirits. To don such a mask was not mere performance. It was to become the deity for a moment, channeling its power for the good of the people. Spiro's influence extended far beyond Oklahoma's rolling plains. Artifacts bearing its symbols have been found hundreds of miles away, suggesting that emissaries, priests, or pilgrims traveled widely, spreading their cosmology across the Mississippian world. This network of shared belief created what some scholars call a spiritual confederacy, a loose alliance of cities that, though politically independent, were united by faith and ceremony. Spiro was one of its brightest stars, a beacon of sacred wisdom that guided distant communities. But as with all great civilizations, time brings change. Environmental pressures began to mount. Shifts in river patterns disrupted trade and agriculture. Political tensions may have risen between rival factions. Perhaps the balance that the priests worked so hard to preserve began to falter. The festivals grew quieter. The trade routes slowed. The fires in the temples burned lower. By the late 1400s, the great city of Spiro had begun to fade. The mounds remained, but their people drifted away, some to other settlements, others absorbed into neighboring tribes. The sacred city was left to the winds and the earth, its stories swallowed by time. Yet the legacy of Spiro did not die. The symbols carved into copper and shell lived on in the oral traditions of the descendants who still walk these lands today. Their songs and stories carry echoes of that ancient wisdom, a reminder that the mounds are not ruins but resting places for memory. In the silence of the Oklahoma plains, where the grass moves like waves and the sky stretches endlessly, the spirits of Spiro still linger, the priests who watched the stars, the warriors who danced beneath them, and the gods who walked between. The fall and legacy of Spiro. As the centuries passed, the brilliance of Spiro began to wane, not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow fading, like the last embers of a sacred fire. The city that once pulsed with ceremony, art, and cosmic order grew quiet. The people who had raised mounds to touch the heavens began to drift away, leaving behind only earthworks and memory. Archaeologists still debate the reason for Spiro's decline. Some point to climate change, to long droughts that crippled crops and forced migrations. Others see the shadow of political strife, perhaps conflicts between rival chiefs or priestly lineages. Trade routes that once linked Spiro to the Gulf and the Great Lakes may have faltered. The once balanced world of the Mississippians began to fracture. But perhaps the answer lies deeper, not in one single cause, but in a gradual unraveling of the cosmic balance that had defined their lives. When harmony between earth, water, and sky was broken, so too was the foundation of their faith. By the late 15th century, the great mounds stood empty. The plazas, once alive with song and dance, fell silent. Wind swept across the tall grass plains, whispering through the wooden posts that had marked sacred ground. The city of the priests was gone, yet Spiro did not truly vanish. It slept beneath the soil, preserved by time, waiting for rediscovery. Centuries later, in the early 20th century, settlers and farmers began to notice strange rises in the earth near the Arkansas River in Oklahoma. Locals spoke of ancient mounds, but few imagined what lay beneath. Then came the 1930s. In the depths of the Great Depression, desperate times led to desperate acts. A group of men, treasure hunters rather than archaeologists, leased the land from a farmer. They tunneled into the great mortuary mound, seeking valuables to sell. What they found was beyond imagination. Buried chambers filled with ancient artifacts, copper plates, engraved shells, effigy pipes, pearls, masks, and textiles, all arranged with ceremonial precision. These were not mere objects. They were the sacred possessions of the dead, offerings to gods and ancestors. But before scholars could document them, much of the treasure was lost. Looters tore through the burial chambers, selling items on the black market. Priceless relics, symbols of a lost civilization, were scattered across private collections and pawn shops. When archaeologists finally intervened, they were astonished. Despite the destruction, what remained told a story of extraordinary sophistication. The artistry rivaled anything from ancient Egypt or Mesoamerica. Spiro had not been a backwater. It was a cultural and spiritual capital of its age. The discovery changed how historians viewed the pre-Columbian Americas. No longer could ancient North America be dismissed as a land of simple tribes. Here was proof of cities, trade, and theology, a structured civilization with philosophy, science, and art. For decades, researchers pieced together the fragments. They mapped the mounds, studied the surviving artifacts, and reconstructed the lives of the Mississippian people. Slowly, the forgotten kingdom began to speak again. One of the most haunting finds was the Great Mortuary Chamber, a burial vault where elite leaders or priests were laid to rest with their sacred regalia. The positioning of the bodies, the orientation of the objects, and the symbolism etched into copper and shell all pointed to deep spiritual meaning, an unbroken belief in life beyond death. The iconography revealed a vision of the universe divided into three worlds: the upper world of the sky spirits, the middle world of humans, and the underworld of water and darkness. Serpents, birds, and celestial beings adorned every object, forming a visual scripture that mirrored their myths. To the Mississippians, death was not an end, it was transformation. The dead became ancestors, guiding the living through dreams, storms, and stars. Today, walking among the grassy mounds of Spiro, one feels that presence still. The air is thick with silence, but it is not emptiness. It is reverence. The land itself seems to hum with memory. Modern archaeologists, working with Native American descendants, have approached the site with new respect. The mounds are no longer seen as curiosities, but as sacred spaces. Excavation has given way to preservation. Artifacts are being repatriated to tribes whose ancestors once walked here, including the Caddo, the Wichita, and the Osage nations. Spiro is not just history, it is heritage, a bridge between past and present. In the visitor center near the site, replicas of the artifacts tell the story that the earth once buried. The copper plates shimmer under the museum lights, reflecting the same glow they once caught from ceremonial fires centuries ago. But the true power of Spiro lies not in the artifacts themselves, but in what they represent. A civilization that achieved greatness without iron, wheels, or writing, but through unity, faith, and understanding of nature's rhythms. The Mississippian world was vast, stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf. Spiro was one of its guiding lights, a hub of culture that linked distant peoples through trade and belief. Its collapse reminds us how fragile civilization can be, and how even the mightiest societies depend on balance between humanity and the natural world. As we gaze across the quiet plains of Oklahoma today, it is hard to imagine that this land was once the stage for grand ceremonies that aligned with the stars, for processions of painted dancers and chanting priests, for voices that rose in prayer to gods whose names are now forgotten. But the wind remembers, the soil remembers, and in every artifact, every mound, every echo of the drums that once beat across the prairie, the spirit of Spiro endures. It speaks not of loss, but of continuity, of people who lived in harmony with the cosmos, who sought to understand their place in the great circle of existence. Spiro's fall was not its end. Its legacy flows through the descendants of those who still honor the mounds, through the scholars who preserve its story, and through every listener who seeks to know what came before. The forgotten kingdom of the plains is forgotten no longer. As the sun sets over the Oklahoma hills, its last light touches the grass, turning it gold. The mounds cast long shadows across the earth, silent monuments to a civilization that once reached for the heavens. And in that moment, if you listen closely, you may still hear it, the heartbeat of an ancient people, echoing through time. And so, the story of Spiro, the forgotten kingdom of the plains, fades into twilight. A civilization that once reached for the heavens now rests quietly beneath the earth. But its voice still whispers through time. In every mound, in every artifact, and in every breath of wind across the Oklahoma plains, the memory of its people lives on. History is not only written in books, it is carved in the soil, sung in the stars, and remembered by those who choose to listen. If this journey through ancient America moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Forgotten Civilizations, where every week we uncover the lost cities, vanished cultures, and untold stories buried beneath our own land. Because sometimes, to understand who we are, we must first remember who we were. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, like, and join us again as we continue to unveil the mysteries of ancient America.